So good day, everyone, and welcome to the IOER Forum, the first edition of the new year 2022, actually. As you all know, this forum is the regular platform for debates in the spatial sustainability sciences of the Leibniz-Institut of Ecological, Urban, and Regional Development. And this edition is recorded and made available on our YouTube channel as well. So in case of any privacy concerns, please consider switching off your camera or removing your name tag. You can also put on sunglasses or wear a false mustache if you like. That's for you to consider. In case of that, then of course you have to decide so, especially during the presentations, because this is the part that we will record, and this is the part that we will also make available, not during the discussion part. Yeah, that will be cut off and will not be recorded. Yeah, this forum is a science dialogue, so it consists of two scientific contributions, a main pitch by our distinguished guest speaker, and followed by a co-pitch from one of our researchers here at IOER. After each talk, you will have, of course, the opportunity for briefly asking clarification questions if needed. And then the second half will essentially be dedicated to joint discussion. So a very warm welcome, therefore, to the IOER Forum today as a science dialogue, as I said, on place-based sustainability transformations. My name is Mark Wolfram. I'm the director of the Leibniz-Institut of Ecological, Urban, and Regional Development. And I'm very happy, of course, to introduce our guest speaker for today, which is Professor Lummina Horlings. Welcome, first of all. Professor Horlings is a professor for social spatial planning at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands since 2016. And before that, she has been at Wageningen University for 6 years as an assistant professor in the rural sociology group. And she has also had various research positions, including at Cardiff University, UK, for instance. She has a background in social geography and a PhD in policy sciences. And her research deals with place-based local regional development and sustainable place shaping, with her current focus being on transformative citizens and community responses to climate change. She also co-coordinated the Marie Curie ITN program SusPlace on sustainable place shaping, and is co-initiator, partner of the Marie Curie ITN project RECOMS on resourceful communities, which some of you may be familiar with. And I also have seen that you're a member of the academic platform, academic board of the platform Sustainable Society in Groningen. So apparently also some engagement in the local context of transdisciplinary research. So that's something we may also want to pick up later on. So very warm welcome. And you will be talking today on transforming places together, citizens and community engagement, responding to climate change. So the floor is yours, Professor Horlings.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Wolfram, for this nice introduction. I'm really pleased to see so many participants during this meeting. And thanks for having me at this meeting organized by your institute. I would like to start this presentation with a quote of one of the most famous German writers, Goethe, who said, "Mit dem Wissen wächst der Zweifel." So I think the more we know, the more we doubt about what we know. And I think the COVID pandemic has learned us that uncertainty, for example, and unpredictability and non-linearity are characteristics of our time and our society, and we have to live with it. And I think the pandemic also taught us something else, that we are insufficiently prepared for crisis. So this is the starting point of my presentation. In my opinion, COVID is just a rehearsal for the biggest challenge of our time, which is, of course, the climate crisis. And during this public lecture, I will talk about the urgency for societal transformation to address the root causes of this crisis. And the key question I would like to discuss with you is how, and to present, is how citizens' initiatives, movements, and also resourceful communities take the lead in transforming places together. And the picture, which you can see here on the slide, illustrates this, showing a group of people planting a windmill. So a wide variety and increasing amount of initiatives, and as well as social movements, is emerging, taking matters in their own hand within the so-called do-it-yourself democracy. And I think this is potentially a hopeful message, although there might be not so much reason for hope. However, I think by taking action, we might create hope, as Greta Thunberg already mentioned. So as Mark already said, my name is Ina Horlings, and I'm a professor in social spatial planning. And I will draw some inspiration from these two programs. And RECOMS is about resourceful communities, especially about transdisciplinary and creative approaches, and towards resilient communities. And secondly, the other program is about sustainable place shaping. I will also present then some lessons from these two programs. Please, the next slide. So this lecture will deal with three key questions or key themes. First, why is there a need for transformative responses to climate change? And what is then transformation? And secondly, why are places still relevant in the context of climate crisis and changing places? And third, what transformative responses to climate crisis are developed by collective initiatives, and how to support such responses. By the way, here you see a picture from the climate march last November, where 40,000 people, including me, were marching for more climate justice in Amsterdam. The other picture is from a landscape fund in the city of Nijmegen, where farmers and citizens work together. So a side note before I start, by focusing on bottom initiatives, I want by no means suggest that citizens carry the solution or are responsible for navigating the climate crisis. I think the largest impact in terms of reducing CO2 emissions has to come from greening large industries and changing sectors like the transport system, and also from governmental policies facilitating a change of our economic system. But having said that, this focus here is on citizens' initiatives. And next slide, please. I don't need to explain to you that we are currently facing a climate emergency. Looking at the COP meeting in Glasgow, we are heading towards disaster, catastrophe, and societal disruptions. As Professor Jem Bendel has argued, we need a deep adaptation, already preparing for societal collapse. And I can recommend his paper, which and the link is here in this slide. Furthermore, our planet faces a quadruple squeeze of urban growth and urbanization, climate change, loss of biodiversity, and also a surprise factor referring to issues such as which we cannot predict, such as the COVID pandemic. With regard to ecosystems and biodiversity, we also face a crisis. For example, now more than 500 species of land animals are found to be on the brink of extinction. So the situation is very serious. The sea level will further rise. Here on this slide, you see a moving picture of the rising sea level in the Netherlands. And Dutch research institutes have now seriously explored a worst case scenario where all Dutch people have to migrate to Germany. So I hope we are welcome. Please go to the next slide. The threats of our climate change are the direct result of our unsustainable way of living. The levels of carbon dioxide in the air have risen exponentially and further increased after the lockdown. The Paris Agreement was to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, implicating a maximum CO2 budget. We have now used almost 90% of this budget. In the carbon brief of Simon Evans, the link was on the previous slide, you can find a very interesting video showing how countries over time use this carbon budget. For example, Germany holds the 6th place of CO2 emissions in the world. A key problem is, what we tend to forget is that all CO2 ever emitted since the industrial revolution contributes to global warming and will continue to do so, even if we stop the emissions altogether and right now. So this is a non-linear and non-reversible situation, unless we also actively remove CO2 out of the atmosphere. And there are, of course, some technologies available, but it can only be used on a small scale so far. David Wallace-Wells has explained this very nicely in an interesting article in the New Yorker. So if we then turn our attention to this picture, this shows that our planet Earth is a system, and its stability is dependent of all sorts of mechanisms that influence each other, such as the Atlantic circulation, the dieback of the Amazon, the acidification of the ocean, and the melting of the glaciers. Many of these mechanisms have now reached an environmental tipping point, or threshold. Beyond 1.5 degrees temperature rise, biophysical feedbacks create a situation beyond human control, called runaway climate change. And we are now heading towards 3 degrees temperature rise in 2100, which is an unlivable situation, as you can imagine. And this will largely increase the possibility of a hothouse Earth scenario, as argued by the scientist Will Steffen. So Will Steffen and others have also created this picture, and you can read more in the via this link in this slide. Next slide, please. So in this context, incremental adaptation is not sufficient. It's reactive, local, and short-term oriented, and it doesn't address the root causes of climate change. As you can see on these pictures, situations of incremental adaptation don't address sufficiently the current structures, systems, behaviors, as well as existing lock-ins, path dependencies, and vested interest. It also doesn't address the uncertainties and risks and the current dominant assumptions that contribute to social vulnerability. And multiple scholars have argued this, and therefore you can also see a recent shift of scholars towards concepts like transformative adaptation. For example, in the context of social ecological systems, as you can see here. Next slide, please. So there is a need for more long-term strategies and responses to climate change, taking into account issues of justice, power, and equity. So transformative adaptation, I already mentioned it, addresses the root causes of climate risk, not just focusing on the Western world, but also shifting systems towards more sustainable, socially just and equal trajectories, also for the countries who face the most risks. And transformative adaptation also activates social tipping points. As Rutstrom already mentioned, not just environmental tipping points, but also societal tipping points are important. And I think two of these tipping points are especially relevant here: the broadening of public consensus about the ethical and moral implications of our reliance on fossil fuels, and secondly, the strengthening of climate education and climate engagement, and so especially citizens' engagement. So together with a former student of mine, Willebijn Schreuder, I've conducted a literature study to look at transformative adaptation. And based on 74 articles so far, it shows that transformation includes at least the following elements, though a clear definition cannot be provided, I think, and should not be provided, because transformative adaptation is implemented in various ways. But key elements can be mentioned, like system-wide, persistent, and restructuring change. This challenges the existing power and governance structures, but also the worldviews and values that may impede change. It also challenges the way we have organized the economy. It's future-oriented and focused on a more long-term planning. Mitigation and innovation changes the status quo with business as usual, and greenwashing by creating more and interesting and sustainable alternatives and opportunities. And I would like to emphasize here, this requires not just technical innovation, but also especially maybe social innovations and a change in relations between people and nature. Third is about integration. Transformative adaptation should obviously be considered from a multi-scale perspective, especially as from a geographical perspective, the causes, the impacts, and the solutions of climate change happen on different geographical scales. Integration refers to different dimensions of climate change and also different dimensions of community responses, such as ecological, social, economic, technological, and political dimensions. Integrative development refers to different spheres of transformation, which I will explain in a minute. The last point, new pathways, refers to new place-based and sustainable pathways. The literature already recognizes that it's often communities that bring about transformation. And this can also be considered as niche innovation, spaces for experimenting and learning that produce alternative practices. So, and I will show some concrete examples of community initiatives later. Next slide, please. This is one of my key interests. Transformation is not just about what we do, but more importantly about the why. The Sufi philosopher and poet Rumi mentioned already in the 13th century, "Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I'm wise, so I'm changing myself." Transformation requires not just practical and political actions, but also personal change, changing ourselves, or change from the inside out. And this is visualized here in the picture made by Karen O'Brien from the University of Oslo. The personal sphere, which is visualized here in the outer circle, represents changes in meaning making, including individual and shared values, beliefs, and worldviews that shape our attitudes as well as our actions. This emphasizes how we give meaning to the world, and it also acknowledges the importance of social consciousness in transformation processes. The figure of the iceberg shows that we tend to focus on what we see above water, the things we see in the world, or behavior, or organizations, or structures, the built environment, what we plan, and so on. The part underwater includes more subjective and intersubjective aspects like values, beliefs, emotions, mental images, emotions, motivations, and intentions. It is less visible, but equally important. It is also important in the context of discussions and communication. For example, when we talk about our opinions, this might appear as being on the top of two different icebergs, and polarization and conflicts might occur. However, if we dive underwater, for example, in a dialogue, we might see it's actually one iceberg, though we talk from different positions. So the message here is that by focusing on what we really care about, we can find a common ground rooted in joint universal values, such as compassion, solidarity, and justice. Next slide, please. So I now arrive at the second question of this lecture. As we are here with a group of colleagues engaged with spatial development and planning, I would like to ask, are place and space still relevant in the context of a fast-changing society? Structuring processes such as modernization and globalization have influenced places all over the world. According to the famed Dutch architect Rem Koolhaas, maybe you know him, we witness a generic city as a result of capitalism, shown in the left picture. According to him, the city has become unmakeable. Planning makes no difference. He uses the metaphor of an airport where there is no authentic culture, identity, or history, and argues that places increasingly look the same everywhere. The generic city is without characteristics, without identity, and without a past. It is without a soul. However, I would argue that place is more relevant than ever. Although generic processes like capitalism and globalism affect places, indeed, they also play out spatially in different ways, creating territories of difference, as Escobar has argued. Furthermore, people, of course, have agency and are able to change a place to their needs, ideas, and values. So not as a defensive response, but as a proactive power, changing the network of social relations of which they're part of. So I've visualized this here in the picture of a sea in turmoil, as we are living, as Bauman said, in a liquid society where everything continuously is changing. And people are trying to socially navigate within this liquid society. Next slide, please. So places, in my opinion, are still relevant in three ways. As arenas of debates and protests on land use and functions, reflecting power struggles and negotiation. Here you see a picture on the right from a group of citizens protesting against gas extraction in the north part of Groningen, where I live. Due to earthquakes in this area, a lot of people a group of people has started a movement against this gas extraction. Secondly, places are also important for a sense of place and belonging. This is a picture of an artwork made in the north part of Groningen as part of a project called Sense of Place to strengthen the identity of the area. I think in a world of global flows, mobility and migration, we are still in need of a place we can attach meaning to, a place we can call home. Thirdly, places are also relevant in the context of place-based policies, as you know, not leaving people and places behind. I think the Regional Studies Association has published a really nice and interesting report about this. Every place matters. You can see a picture of this, of the cover of this book here. Next slide, please. A bit of theoretical background on just place and sustainable place shaping before I move to concrete examples. I think a relational approach to place and space is very useful to understand how places are not merely geographical locations on a map, but also the outcomes of practices, relations, and interactions stretching beyond geographical or administrative boundaries. I would like to honor Dori Messi here, the geographer, who helped us to understand place as a kind of thrown togetherness, showing how local practices are embedded in the complexities of wider spatial connections. In other words, sometimes I use for students the metaphor of a plate of spaghetti. It's an entanglement of different threads. If you pull out one thread of the spaghetti, everything changes. And so this also happens with places. Places is continuously changing due to changing social relations and due to connections with other places, and also influenced by wider structuring processes. It is without fixed identities and connected to other places. So places are dynamic, and this relational approach transcends local global divisions. So in a way, you can't talk about places as local or global. It's both. To illustrate this, here you see a picture of the eco-village Siebenlinden in Germany. Eco-villages are resourceful, using their place-based resources in the development of practices such as sustainable housing and permaculture. These practices are not just local, as I said, but also the result of global flows of people, ideas, and knowledge, strengthened by the participation of the community in a global eco-village network. Next slide, please. In the program Place, and I've provided here the link to the stakeholder report, which provides a really nice overview of all the 15 PhD projects within this program. We developed in this program an actor perspective, connecting people to place. And we developed this framework, this propeller model, to show that place is shaped by the interaction of unbounded, ordering, political economic processes, ecological processes, and social-cultural processes, the blades of the propeller. However, people are also able to change these relations and these processes. And we define sustainable place shaping here as the capacity of people to localize and embed their practices, their daily lived practices, in social ecological systems and place-based assets, thus altering the relations between people and their environment. So in concrete words, place shaping connects people to place. And this can potentially contribute to their self-efficacy and also their autonomy. Sustainable place shaping then results from a coordination of three processes: reappreciation, which refers to people's sense of place, as I just explained, the ways people attach symbolic values to their environment, processes of regrounding in place-specific assets and resources. Think of the production of local food, for example. And third, a repositioning towards markets. And this can alter the relations with shape places by developing economic practices like social economy businesses, social services, alternative products and markets, all based on place-based assets. So these three processes are key elements of agency in place shaping. And the initiatives and movements I will discuss next can be seen as examples of sustainable place shaping. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, but first another slide, just to show that these programs also provide really nice outputs. And first, I would like to say that creative and art-based methods can support sustainable place shaping by imagining new futures and pathways. Some of the PhDs involved in such place have developed a toolkit shown here to engage people in a creative way. The toolkit arts-based methods, and they stimulate people to engage in places from a non-human and long-term perspective, which can then result in a shift in mindset. The picture shows a workshop during a conference on transformation to sustainability, where we all had to imagine that we were an animal. You can see me here as an owl. And we applied this on a specific case and tried to plan a village in Finland based on a non-human perspective. And interestingly, the imagined future of the place was different after the workshop, in the sense that we looked at different aspects, like a more long-term perspective and also the perspective of nature. So yeah, this toolkit provides all kinds of nice examples how to engage people in place shaping. And the other picture shows a book which has just been published last month, a book on co-creative methods in research and engaged scholarship, edited by Alex Franklin, and you can download it for free. And the picture here shows an example of cultural mapping, creative mapping, which has been carried out by one of my PhDs in Groningen. And she tries to map the different voices in places, not just the dominant voices, but also the unseen and unheard voices in a creative way. Yeah. Next slide, please. So third point I would like to address is actually the main point is, how do place-based citizen initiatives and resourceful communities and movements respond to climate change. And I've just started this research with some literature review together with a former student of mine. And actually in February, I will start a sabbatical research leave for several months and exploring this topic further in different European countries, traveling to different resourceful communities and interesting institutes. Yeah, next slide, please. We see an emergence of citizens' initiatives in the last decades in the context of what we can call the do-it-yourself democracy or a self-governing society, taking matters in their own hand. Here you see a picture of a landscape fund in which I was involved for 10 years, where citizens co-finance farmers and make arrangements with them to develop nature and landscape qualities. The second picture shows a group of volunteers in Groningen who produce food in the middle of the city. And the produce is then delivered to an urban food bank in Groningen. So the volunteers don't eat the food themselves, but it's delivered to all kinds of citizens in the city. And third, you see a sustainable co-housing project in the city of Nijmegen, close to the border with Germany. And it's all built from straw and also completely designed with renewable energy. So, and furthermore, you see a windmill here. There are hundreds of energy cooperatives now in the Netherlands, started by communities producing solar and wind energy. And you can find more information in the 3 articles listed in this slide. Next slide, please. However, this is not just a Dutch phenomenon or a European phenomenon. It has become a worldwide phenomenon. Some initiatives take the form of movements, for example, local communities, which are networked on a larger scale, such as ecovillages and transition towns. And furthermore, we can witness an increase in climate action groups, such as Extinction Rebellion or Fridays for Future. And of course, we see a lot of movements fighting for social and environmental justice. Paul Hawken already listed hundreds of such movements in 2007 in his book, Blessed and the Rest. And since then, the amount of these movements has exploded, you could say. Next slide. Together with Willemijn Schreuder, we have started to explore resourceful networked communities and movements. And such movements are very relevant to develop niche innovations and potentially supporting transformation on a larger scale. So here you see some examples like Ecolis, Global Ecovillage Network, the Donut Action Lab, and so on. But by no means this covers, of course, all these movements. The picture shows an ecovillage in the east part of Groningen, where people try to develop a sustainable housing and sustainable way of living. Next slide. Unfortunately, this is not so well readable, but this is just to show that we have ordered all these practices along different dimensions of transformation: social, cultural, ecological, technological, and so on. And that we have also identified different strategies of communities responding to climate change, like capacity building, justice and equality, and so on. So I will show some examples of these cases, who often combine multiple strategies. So for example, if you combine capacity building and ecology, you see here the restoring of ecosystems. Or if you combine capacity building with technology, you see that the exploration of self-sufficiency and the building of solar farms and the use of local materials. So all these cells can be filled, and but often movements are combining different activities and different strategies. And next slide. So first, the strategies for community, for capacity building. This concerns practices that allow them to increase their self-sufficiency, autonomy, and level of self-governance. And this is often achieved through a focus on local or place-based characteristics and local agency to govern that place. So For example, the Coastal Community Network in Scotland promotes the voice of communities as a means to improve their local marine environment, and providing those communities with capacity to sustain their livelihoods depending on fishing and tourism. And it's a kind of a network. So you can see a map with 19 different communities. The Ilha da Calutra in Portugal is an island community which partnered with the University of Algarve, developing a participative process and creating a platform for knowledge exchange. As a result, the community has now become more self-sufficient in resources based on desalination of water, solar farms, and an energy storage system, and an off-grid energy distribution system. So both cases of capacity building illustrate the importance to create a sense of community spirit as a start, and then building social cohesion and community engagement. And in both cases, this resulted in successful ownership, community ownership, and management of their resources. Learning and experimentation. These strategies are very important for creating novelties, but also to embed these innovations for more enduring change. And you could say it's also a condition for scaling up. An example is the Sunseed Desert Initiative in Spain, in Andalusia. They educate people within, but also outside their own community, how to adopt sustainable, responsible, and low-impact lifestyles themselves. And they share and exchange their knowledge, ideas, for example, via organizing tours, youth exchange, courses, and school visits. And next slide. So the following strategy is about justice and equality, as all the analyzed movements so far have values and principles that promote more justice and equality. For example, the Donut Economy Action Lab in Devon in the UK is a platform for bottom-up science and citizens, and demonstrates a vision and framework for safe and just space for humanity. It is inspired by the donut model of Kate Raworth, and they have adapted this model to their own context. You can see here some pictures of their meetings, and they have gathered local social and ecological data on issues that they find important themselves, and they want to measure these issues. In their view, a political voice should be given to the community, as they suggest they have the answers for meeting social needs themselves. So they started a process of collaboration. The strategy of inner transformation refers to the iceberg and the inner dimension of transformation I explained earlier. It includes being engaged in places with the head, heart, hands, and feet. And one of our PhDs made this picture to show this, and it's included in the Such Place stakeholder report. So it's not just being rationally or mentally engaged, but also via your own, taking into account your own values and your own ideas and mindsets. So inner transformation includes being engaged as a whole person by rethinking the way of doing, knowing, and being in the world, and becoming conscious of what drives your own, but also other actions. The actions we can change from the inside out. And this can then reframe the economy, social relations, and governance. To give a concrete example, some eco-villages develop new ways how to handle conflicts between people. And Siri Pistes showed how some eco-villages, for example in Finland, are driven by values of connection, compassion, and creativity in place-based transformative learning. Next slide. Place shaping is more about making physical changes in places here. It shows how communities physically shape places through self-governance. An example is Ocean Witness, which unites coastal fishermen associations who promote community-led conservation actions for fishing in specifically coastal regions. So they developed marine protection areas, for example. to restore the areas and to get also more control of these areas. All network movements, of course, are involved in scaling processes, but in different ways. And based on different authors, we made a difference between different types of scaling. So first of all, amplification beyond an initiative. This is also called scaling out. This is what we often call scaling. You know, it refers to increasing the number of initiatives or innovations. It also refers to replication of innovations in other places or spreading core principles and approaches to other places. The other form of scaling is called here amplification or scaling beyond. And this refers to the process that aim to increase the initiative's impact. And this can be done by, for example, scaling up or by scaling deep. Scaling up aims to provide the necessary institutional shifts in law, policy, and resource flows. And scaling deep aims to transform the subjective and intersubjective values and relationships and cultural practice within the initiative. So of course, then for scaling deep, learning and experimentation is very important. Yeah, next slide. Now my last slides are about what are then specific conditions to enable such resourceful communities. I've done some research on leadership, especially place leadership. And place leadership is also very important for enabling transformative communities. And scholars have conceptualized this as, for example, place leadership in the book from Soterata and al. In 2012, new civic leadership, like Hamilton has argued, but also community leadership. And I think though individual leadership is often important, for example, to start an initiative, the more collective or shared or distributed forms of leadership are often more important in the context of collective action. And I often ask my students, who is the leader in this picture where you see a swarm of these? And the answer is, of course, here, everyone, every geese is here a leader, because everyone can be a leader at some point. Leadership can change over time. And, you know, I have a vision on leadership that it's very personal, not just people who hold positional power or authorities can be leaders, but in fact, everyone can be a leader. Leadership is, of course, relational. It connects local agency with wider networks. This means also that policy skills like networking or advocacy, lobbying, coalition building are relevant for leaders to build strategic relationships. Leaders support the alignment of actors around joint narratives to create a sticky story, which is appealing for people. A visionary role is very key here to identify and articulate what people want, their collective purpose, and to communicate and develop this into narratives. And furthermore, these are very important to provide an unlocking capacity of connecting different sectors, themes, logics, and cultures in order to create innovation. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, besides building capacities and leadership, of course, an inclusive and more enabling governance and planning is a crucial condition to support resourceful communities. We have seen a shift from top-down technocratic forms of planning, so-called blueprint planning, as is visualized here on the slide, towards more collaborative planning. And new roles of specifically socio-spatial planning include, I think, a community-sensitive roles, also to get a sense what will happen in the future, what will be important aspects to address, a mediating role between stakeholders, an imaginative role, which also refers to the role of design, and value-based roles towards communities. In addition, of course, there's a need for a more ambitious and clear political agenda, including financial investments and attention for social justice, well-being, and solidarity. Yeah. Then now I arrive at my last slides. I hope it wasn't too long. To conclude, summarizing our research so far concludes that the following conditions are important for resourceful communities. Last slide, yeah. As I said, capacity building in the Recons program, we make a difference between unlocking and empowering, adapting and transforming, and connecting and collaborating. But other authors like Holscher have made other distinctions in capacity building. The development of joint narratives, as argued in the transformation, so a change not just in our practices and political actions, but also a change in our own beliefs, our values and worldviews that drive our behavior. Shared leadership, which includes alignment, visioning, change agents, policy and bridging skills, and an inclusive and enabling governance. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ina, for the excellent and insightful input. So we would have a few minutes for some immediate questions of understanding or clarification, since, as you all know, the discussion will follow up afterwards. So if you would like to ask such a question, you can do so by raising your hand. So that's by using the Zoom button, and I would then invite you to raise this question. Are there any immediate reactions in terms of understanding, clarification? Doesn't seem to be the case. So therefore, I would suggest we move forward, and I'd like to invite the second speaker for today from the IOER, which is our colleague Franziska Ehnert. Franziska is a senior researcher at the IOER since 2014 with the Institute. And she has been working as a researcher before 3 years at the University of Potsdam, at the chair of political science, administration, and organization. And her background is in political science and economics from the universities in Munich and Heidelberg. And her research deals with urban transitions towards sustainability, transition governance, citizen participation, as well as policy change. Here at IOER, she has been working on Horizon project, Horizon 2020 Arts, accelerating regional transitions towards sustainability. Some of you may know the project, as well as a IOER project on the potential of transition town initiatives, and is heavily involved in the Future City project since 2017, where the city of Dresden is actually one of the selected ones, funded by the German Ministry for Science and Education. And the local project here has the title Dresden, City of the Future, Empowering Citizens and Transforming Cities. So very pertinent, therefore, and Franziska will talk about reframing places, communities, and identities, the contextualization of social learning processes in urban experimentation. Franziska, the floor is yours.
Yes, as Mark Wolfram already introduced, this is about the reframing of places, communities, and identities, the contextualization of social learning processes in urban experimentation, and it is part of the research we are doing in the project City of the Future. And I conducted this research together with my colleague, Anna Batz. Perhaps you can give a brief sign-up that you're there. And to begin with, when we were at the beginning of this research, we found that there's a limited understanding of how and why social learning processes emerge from open experimentation, and that also the processes of social material learning in urban experiments was still underexplored. So we wanted to better understand the contextualization of experimentation in local contexts and how this relates to the reframing of places, communities, and identities. Therefore, we pursue the following two research questions in this comparative study. These are: how do social, spatial, and social material contexts shape and are reshaped by social learning processes, and which processes of social learning emerge from urban experimentation? For our conceptual framework, we built on the literature on social learning in sustainability transition research, and we understand learning as a process of changing understandings and meanings, so to interrupt non-reflexive routines by a process of reflection. And we decided to focus this research on 4 dimensions of social learning. The first is cognitive and normative learning, which is about changing knowledge, skills, norms, and values, and builds on the concepts of single loop, double loop, and triple loop learning. Relational learning is about establishing new relations between individuals, groups, networks, but also institutions based on trust and building a common understanding. And last but not least, social material learning is about a change in the relations to objects, artifacts, and spaces. So these relations include knowledge about, but also the values associated with these materials and spaces. And we argue, or we want to find out, how social material relations can alter interconnected practices. And what we want to understand and illustrate is how the context, the learning processes are situated and shape and can also be reshaped by learning. And so we studied these contexts as social spatial and social material contexts. This is builds on social practice theory and implies that we adopt the relational and social constructivist understanding of space. And so this means to shed light on the meanings attached to artifacts and spaces and analyze how space is co-produced by communities and actors. And we investigated these questions by doing a comparative case study. And this is embedded in the project City of the Future, which is a transdisciplinary and transformative research project here in Dresden. It seeks to co-produce knowledge together with stakeholders and scientists to transform the city. And overall, there are 10 transition experiments implemented by citizens in co-production with research partners in the city. And here we want to present a comparative case study of 2 of these transition experiments. One is schools as living spaces created together, and the other one are the district funds and councils for sustainable and active neighborhoods. And the first is inspired by the do-it-yourself and do-it-together culture and seeks to introduce methods of nature education and participation in a school. And the second provides a funding tool for micro-projects within the district to promote local transitions. And so it wants to strengthen decentralization and the participation at the precinct scale. What could we observe? For the first, schools as living spaces created together, we found that it was the initial motivation of the school to enhance their reputation, to enhance or to deal with social problems they were encountering in their school community. But by cooperating with the transition experiment, they started to appreciate the participatory and ecological approach of the experiment and began to adopt this idea of nature education. For relational learning, we could find that the school community was strengthened by the collective planting and building activities because they supported a sense of belonging. And also they had to reach a more diverse community in the school because manual activities like joint planting or crafting activities removed language barriers and enabled also migrants to join and participate in the process. So this considerably helped in community building. Also this joint building and planting activities and the recreation of the schoolyard in this participatory manner provided the students, the teachers and the parents an experience of self-efficacy. Also, the schoolyard gained an importance for the school due to the impulses of the experiment and the pandemic, where more activities were moved outdoors. And by building new physical infrastructures and new objects in the schoolyard, the identification with and the commitment to the school community could be strengthened, because this more or less created a sense of ownership and responsibility for the objects, which were now treated with more care. For the second transition experience, we could observe that there was a new reappreciation for participation at the local level through the participation in the district funds. And this helps to counteract the disenchantment with politics. But we also found that many of the participants were already engaged citizens, were already socially or ecologically minded, or both, so that the potential for normative learning was limited. We would rather argue that the participation in the funds reaffirmed the values of these citizens. The participation in the district funds also strengthened the relations within the orbit district and community building. It helped to better network existing local organizations with municipal institutions and local businesses. And very similar to the school or the other transition experiments in the school, recreating the urban district, building new infrastructures in the district, and provided this experience of self-efficacy for the citizens. And also local infrastructures became better known and used more often by the participants. So this contributed to a relocalization of everyday routines. And ultimately, this also strengthened the identity building and the commitment to the neighborhood. And this brings me to my final slide. With these findings, we can contribute to two strands of literature. One is the literature on social learning processes and sustainability transitions, and the other is the literature on the geography of transitions. For the first, the meanings associated to spaces and materials are often a subconscious part of daily routines, and therefore they are neither questioned by scholars nor by practitioners. And by defining or highlighting this dimension of social learning, we mean to make those meanings and interpretations visible. And this resembles the picture of the iceberg that was presented earlier, where a lot of things are below the surface, they remain invisible, but that would not or should not suggest that they are less important. And we could also show that learning processes do not only concern the relations between people, but they are also about processes of sense-making and place-making by co-producing space and materials through interpretation. And for future research, it would be interesting to investigate the emergence and effects of social material learning processes in more depth. And for the debate on the geography of transitions, we meant to show how transition experiments are contextualized in urban districts and how this can support learning and identity building. And we wanted to illustrate how a reframing of places, communities, and identities can alter interconnected practices and daily routines. And we also have to say that both districts we studied already had a history of previous engagement by civil society. They had very high social capital. So for future research, it would be interesting to explore when and why urban districts can provide optimal spaces for experimentation and learning. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. Also invite you to visit our project website. And of course, we will welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Franziska. And thanks again to both of you for your very interesting contributions. I think that gives us an excellent basis for our discussion today.